Okay, so what I have on the screen, I'm not selling our seminary, I'm just showing you resources. We have a Concordia Theology site, and there we have this link called The Pulpit, and underneath that link, three things that I'd like to point out for you. One is in the middle, the lectionary at lunch. I'm sure you're familiar with that. We just have an exegete who reads through each of the texts and basically just goes through the grammatical and syntactical stuff in the original language. So if you want to kind of have some help as you do that in sermon prep, it's a real simple and easy way to do it. At the very bottom, there's this thing called the Preacher's Studio, and that was kind of a brainchild I had. I got tired of people complaining about how Missouri Synod preaching sucked, and I think we've got some good preachers. The problem is that we don't listen to their sermons in context or with an understanding of what they're trying to do. And so what I've done is I just interview preachers, if they're preaching in the chapel, interview them, talk to them about, what it is that they were trying to do. So you've got a sermon here by Eric Herman dealing with the commemoration of von Staupitz. So you can listen to the sermon, and then Eric and I will just kind of discuss what he was doing, and I'll point out some homiletical theory as we learn. It's a really easy way to catch up on homiletical theory, hear a sermon, and then just listen to, well, why did he do that? Because you'll say there and say, oh, that sermon sucked because he did that. And then when you hear him explain, oh, this is why I did it, you're like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. So it's a way of kind of opening up the veil. Now, this is what we're actually going to do with John tomorrow. Right, so I have a sermon, we're going to do a preacher studio with him. We'll just watch the sermon and we'll talk about it. So that's that, but the main reason I'm showing you this is because of what we're going to cover now. I have a site here called Sermon Structures, and I've divided sermon structures into all of these different forms. You have the thematic structures, which is what we've been talking about in the broad sense this morning. You have textual structures, and you have dynamic structures. And for any of these structures, when you click on them, you should find, I try to do this, you should find it, well, that one doesn't have it. I guess they haven't posted it yet. You should find a description of the structure and then a sample sermon. So you can read about it theoretically and then listen to somebody who's doing it. And they just haven't, I have one for Peter Nafsker for the question answer, they haven't put it up. So what we're going to talk about, we've been talking about preaching the faith or catechetical preaching. And catechetical preaching can be done with thematic structures. And of all of these structures that are listed there, there are two that I'm going to look at this afternoon. One is the question-answered structure, and the other is the classical argument structure. And I'm going to go through the question answered rather quickly because I'm really combining two different sessions into one because I went long on the first section. So the question answered structure is going to be a rather quick overview of it, and then I'll spend much more time in the classical argument structure, giving you a sample sermon from Luther and helping you see how that type of preaching was done. So let's go into the question-answered structure, and let me give you this handout. Okay, if you read the description, as biblical illiteracy grows among God's people, and as our cultural setting raises more and more challenges to the faith, the question-answered sermon structure educates God's people even as it prepares them for witness. So we had talked earlier about preaching the teachings of the faith. This is one simple way to approach that task, would be the question-answered structure. I'd like to start with a story. I have a friend of mine who's not a Christian that I work out with occasionally, and every once in a while, if something about Christianity is in the news, it'll kind of come up in our conversation, and it's an opportunity for witness. So we were working out, it was around Christmas time, And he says to me, just out of the blue, we were bench pressing, and he says to me, so, you believe that God became a little baby, is that right? And I'm like, yeah. God became human in order to save us. That's what I believe. And he's like, so how does that work? He's like, does he like remember he's God, or does he just forget he's God? I mean, does he need to eat? And I'm like, well, I mean, he's fully human, so he eats, he sleeps, he cries, and he's fully God, and he uses those powers, he heals people, and that kind of stuff. He says, so what happened in heaven when God came down? I mean, was heaven empty now because God came down to earth? Well, I didn't want to go into the Trinity. I'm just like, I'm not going there. So I said, God has this quality of omnipresence. He can be everywhere at once. So he was here, but he's also there. And so we were going on like this for a while. And then he just kind of looked at me. He got this smirk on his face, and he winked, and he said, oh yeah, you Christians, you got all the answers. And I realized what had happened, right? These are questions the church has asked and fought centuries over. How does the human nature and the divine nature of Christ relate to one another? I mean, these are not simple questions. The answers are easy to access today, because we've actually fought over them and created creeds to confess these things. So the answers are easy to access, but the questions themselves are extremely hard and very good questions. And I gave this guy the impression that, oh yeah, these are just simple questions and we have these easy answers, right? Rather than actually acknowledging that, yeah, this is a really good question, and Christians have struggled to figure this out, and modeling for him what it is like to think theologically about a topic. So the purpose of the question-answered sermon structure is to do two things: to model theological inquiry as you teach the truths of the faith. Often we think that our goal is simply to teach the truths of the faith. And so I'm going to give you the truth and I'm going to teach it to you. But the question and answered structure is actually saying, you know what, something else is going on when we answer questions. We're modeling how we think theologically. What I modeled to my friend was Christians have all the answers. You raise a question and boom, I can give you an answer like that. Just, as if this is simple and these are not complex and, you're an idiot for not knowing it. I mean, I didn't mean to do it that way, but that's the way I did it. I was just thankful I knew an answer, right? When you answered the question, like, well, thank God I know that one. I can get that one right. But we want to be able to model how to think theologically, even as we answer questions that are difficult for our hearers. So if that's your goal, when you work with a question-answered structure, if you'll turn the page over, your structure will look like this. The sermon will open by asking the opening question. There's going to be one question that will guide the process of thinking and discovery in the sermon. In doing this, I'll just kind of cover the front and the back, all on the back. So we'll just ignore the front, we'll just kind of go here. In doing that, on asking the opening question, some of the qualities that you're going to want in that question are as follows. You will want the question to be one that cannot be easily answered. So it should not be a yes or no question. It should be one for which there are many possible answers. So what is the state of the soul after death? What is the relationship between soul and body? Right, these are what does it mean to be blessed? Why does Jesus command people not to tell people about his miracles? Right, these are all questions that Christians could come up with several reasonable answers to. Okay, so the first quality of the question is it should not be simple or not be easily answered. The second quality is you want the question to be developed in such a way that it is significant for the hearers. It is significant for the hearers. So I often do it by opening with a story where the problem of the story revolves around this question. You know, so talking with somebody who is concerned that they're not a Christian or they're not in God's favor because their life isn't blessed. So they're kind of struggling with prosperity gospel stuff. I tell that story to raise that question, what does it mean to be blessed? What does it mean to be blessed, right? So you've got a story from life experience usually, or it could be from the text, that the text itself raises some bizarre question to people. So you're in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is doing miracles, people are rejecting him, and then it says he could not do many miracles there. Well, what? I thought he was God. Can't he do miracles? Why can't God do miracles, right? So you got a question, why can Jesus not do miracles? So the text could bring a question to the surface for people, or it could be a question that you locate in terms of life experience, or the third one is, it could be a question that their culture is asking. So it's not a question that your parishioners have, but it's a question that the culture has, and you raise that question in the context where they kind of feel the pressure of how am I going to defend my faith in that issue, right? So homosexual marriage. Right? That's a question where Christians know the answer, but they don't know how to articulate that answer, right? And so they're going to be interested in the sermon not because they want to figure out what the answer is. They already know the answer, but they don't know how to articulate it. And so you're kind of modeling for them how to speak about the faith with hot-button issues that the culture is asking. So those are, the first quality is that it is not easily answered. Second quality is that it is significant for the hearers. The third quality is that the question should be simple and easy to remember. The questions I gave you, what is the state of the soul after death? What's the relationship between soul and body? What does it mean to be blessed? Why couldn't Jesus do miracles? All of these questions are simple. This is very important because the sermon is going to return to that question again and again and again. And if the question is too complex, it's going to be hard to follow. So it really needs to be a simple one, put colloquially perhaps, so that people can follow it. Now, I've written a lot of these sermons. I kind of like it. It's a fun form. But I have never written a sermon where I had the question right when I started. Okay, so just know that. So kind of, don't think too long about trying to find the perfect question. Just get one that's in the ballpark and start writing the sermon and then go back and revise the question later. Because sometimes I think I'm answering one question and then I end up with something else and I'm like, okay, I need to go change my question, right? So, but then you get it. So at the end, you can get that question simple, easy to remember. It's kind of a long process to get there. And third, sometimes as a preacher, you're going to need to, I call it limit the question. Sometimes questions carry with them all other questions and ideas that come up, and you just may need early on in the introduction to tell the hearers, there's a lot of questions that come up when we think about God creating the world. But really the one I'm going to focus on today is this. That limits it so that they know it's kind of a promise that we're really just going to answer one question today. And if you want me to answer more, come to Bible class or talk to me after the service or something like that, right? So that's the opening of the sermon. Asks an opening question that is significant, simple, not easily answered, and sometimes limited, and sets us on a journey for answering that question. Then, the next step you take is you now think about possible wrong answers to the question. And this is where Lutherans are very good. They usually can drum up, 8 to 20 wrong answers that they want to fight against. So, just kind of meditate, come up with as many wrong answers as you can. Okay, so that's kind of one of the fun things is you think about your question and come up with all these wrong answers. So let's say our text is Romans 8 and that beautiful passage about how we are more than conquerors in the midst of suffering, right? And so the question is, how are Christians more than conquerors in suffering? How are they more than conquerors in suffering? And I can think of one false answer would be, well, because God will prevent them from having suffering in their lives. That's one false answer, that we're going to be a conqueror in suffering because once you become a true Christian, you're not going to suffer in your life, right? And I think there are people out there who actually believe that. Because suffering is punishment from God. I had a member I was talking to once, one of our members had, her son had attempted suicide. Her husband had a loss of a leg. She then had issues with diabetes and with a blood clot, and the member was, kind of talking to me, about these issues and the prayer requests and that type of stuff. And she said, they're doing something wrong. And I thought you were talking about the doctors or something. And I said, that's a good hospital. And that she says, no, she said, this suffering don't come from nowhere. And so there we've got this idea that if you're suffering, something must be wrong with your relationship with God. So one false answer is we're more than conquerors by God preventing suffering from happening in our lives. Another false answer might be, well, we're more than conquerors because God will always deliver us from suffering in this life. Right? And so we think that in this life, a Christian is ultimately going to win. It's going to be a hard battle. It's going to be long. It's going to be hard. But in the end, in this life, you're going to be delivered from suffering. And then your child does not recover and dies. And then you think, maybe I'm not a Christian. Because Christians are more than conquerors in suffering, right? So that would be another false answer. And then finally, the true answer. So you think about false answers, and then you move to the true answer. And for me, the true answer in this case, I might state, Christians are more than conquerors in suffering because God is with them in suffering and ultimately will deliver them from it on the last day. Right? So there I'm going to give you this larger vision, not just this world, but the next world, ultimate deliverance, plus the presence of God in suffering. That's how I'm going to answer it. So you think about possible false answers and then a true answer. In the sermon, so you've got this whole page filled with false answers. Now you want to think about which ones do I want to use? And how would you make that decision?
It could be, if you're using an example to start, it could be something that sparked the example in the first place, where the person was, basically the answer that they had come to.
Right. So you're gonna kind of start. You want it to be coherent with the opening example. So maybe start with the false answer there. But if I've got like 5 wrong answers to this question, how do I know which ones to cover? I don't have all the time in the world when I'm preaching.
You could. I mean, if it's a relevant question, which we're assuming it is, you've probably heard it in your church.
Right. So I want to choose the false answers that my people are struggling with, either in their own lives or in their neighbors. Right. So the false answers that are most predominant for my people are the ones, so it's a very contextualized way of answering this. I'm going to cover the ones that are predominant for my people. So, yeah.
I always like to, I don't use the title false answers, but more just the lies we buy into. And so I always try to think of what are the most common lies.
Right.
There's some that are easy to see through. Mm-hmm. So I try to pick the ones that aren't easy to see through, the ones that people find themselves in those ditches more often than not. Right. And that's where I tend to go with some of these things.
Now for me, in sequencing them, I'm usually, so this sermon design I have on the page, we're going to go through 2 false ones or, 2 lies. But I don't really want my hearers to think of them as lies yet. I want them to just think of them as a possible answer.
Sure.
Right? So I'm not going to play my hand that it's a lie. I'm just going to say, yeah, this is some way that people think about it. So it's going to be a false answer, but I'm going to go through two and then end up with the final one.
I want to keep them on a train.
Right, yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the first one is going to be the one that, let's say, the majority of my members kind of know is wrong, but there are a few for whom they don't know it's wrong. So the majority are kind of going to be on the bus with me saying, yeah, I know people who think that way. And then once I've gained authority and credibility by having, kind of named the person who's struggling with the one, yeah, I know that, that God's not going to make your life prosperity just because you believe in Jesus, that suffering comes into our life, but you know what, he will deliver us from it. And then I move to that one that the majority of my people have, and they're like, oh, okay, well, now you're fighting with me because that's what I'm thinking, yeah? So kind of move from the one where the majority of your people don't think it to the one where the majority of your people do think it. So you kind of sequence them in a way. Now, in doing this, presenting the answer is really important. And I would say that there are two qualities that you want to do. One is you want to present the answer as a reasonable answer. There's reasons that people think this. I mean, it's not like heretics, woke up one morning and said, how can we lead people away from the faith and let's just come up with this idea. No, they actually were using reason and scripture and arriving at things that are heresies. And so I want to help you see, so with the one that, all suffering is punishment from God, I could say, well, we kind of see why we might think that. I mean, when people had sinned in the Old Testament, God punished them. You've got the golden calf episode, you've got this, you've got that, you've got Jonah thrown from the boat. I mean, we've got these. So yeah, it makes some sense to think that, you're more than conquerors in suffering because God he won't punish you. He won't bring suffering into your life if you're following his will, right? So I lay it out in a way that is helping them see how there are some reasons they might think that way. And so number one, give the reasons for it. Number two, be compassionate in your approach. So don't say, some idiots think. Some really stupid people think this. You want to be compassionate in your approach because it may be that some parishioners in your congregation think that way. And what you want is you want them after the sermon to say, Pastor, that's what I was thinking. I'm so glad I was here because that's what I was thinking, and now I'm thinking differently. So that there's no shame for thinking this way, right? Pastor, you know what, Pastor? I'm going to take that coexist bumper sticker off my car. Right? And you're going to say, I already took care of that. No, you're because now that I see that you say, I could understand why some people would think there's many ways to God, but now I realize that that's not the way. So you want to be compassionate, both for those who might have that false answer for themselves and also for how they approach others out in the world. I want them to approach them compassionately and say, yeah, there's some reasons you might be thinking that. All the stories you know about the Bible is about how God punishes people, and he punishes people by, doing horrible things to them. But there's other things in Scripture. So for the false answer, do that. For correcting the false answer, you want to have clear scriptural testimony. That helps you correct the false answer. And this is one of those cases where a lot of questions arise with texts that are less clear, right? So what's the sin against the Holy Spirit? It's hard to answer that because it's found within a narrative, and there's a lot of interpretation that needs to happen there. So instead of only working with the text at hand, which is raising the question, you want to go to the clearest passages that you can find to help answer that question and help show them how this is incorrect. So that's the way you're going to move through the sermon until you come to the final answer, which is going to be I guess we could say the correct answer or the fullest answer. And this is the one that you definitely want to base in the gospel proclamation. Now, throughout the sermon, you might find yourself doing law gospel proclamation in each of these sections. I mean, actually, it may be that you're saying one of the reasons this would not be a correct answer is because this is going against what God and Jesus Christ is doing. And this is the nature of God that we know through Jesus Christ, and so this is not the way that we would approach this. So you can be doing law-gospel dynamics all the way through it, but the basic goal of the sermon is to take people through a process of carefully thinking through a question, using Scripture to correct the false answers, and finally arriving at a correct answer that is centered in Christ. That's going to be the flow of this particular sermon. So I said I was going to go through it quickly for you. I apologize I didn't spend more time with it, but any questions or thoughts about this type of a sermon structure?
This is just my normal face, remember? Confused, conflicted. That's just the way I look.
Oh, okay. So it isn't, you don't have a question. Yeah, you just are a question. Yeah.
You know, I think what's interesting, one of the things that when we've had some of these struggles, we've had some theological things we've really tried to hit and question this way. You know, I think it's really important and try to get at of how you get to the answer, not just get to the answer.
Right. That's the point.
Because the biggest argument I always get on some of these things, well, that's just your interpretation. And I go, well, let's just back up. And you got to get people backed up in that process to go down the road and not just stick in a camp and stay stuck with the answer.
Right.
And that's been a challenge. But I mean,
I'm wondering in our preaching how often sometimes our preaching is maybe confusing, like I was talking about yesterday, getting kind of stuck and spinning wheels and things like this, because maybe we start one kind of structure, like maybe you start the question-answered structure and you're trying to answer the question with a completely different kind of approach rather than just following through with what you've started.
Yeah. That's actually one of the warnings in this sermon design, is that you ultimately need to answer the question. I mean, you've made a contract with your hearers.
Unless you're Jonah, right?
What?
Unless you're Jonah, and then you just don't answer the question.
No, I mean, you've made a contract with your hearers that we're going to think about this and arrive. I mean, because what happens is sometimes there is a sermon form, and it's a good sermon form, and it definitely can be used, but it's not this one. There's a sermon form where you basically, about the last third of the sermon, you say that's a wrong question. This is the question you should be asking. Right? So you kind of set people up with the question they are asking and then say, well, that's the wrong question. Now, I mean, that's a different sermon form. What that sermon form teaches people is that they're idiots. And this is the question they should ask. This sermon form is not teaching that. This sermon form is trying to say, you are not an idiot. That's a really good question. And now let's think through how to answer it. So it's kind of, like you said, it's being aware of what form you're using and what you're trying to inculcate. Right? If you're trying to inculcate that we always ask the wrong questions, and that other form is good, this is not the form for that, because you're going to need to get rid of the question. This form is saying, no, this is a very good question, and people are going astray because they're answering it wrongly. And so let's really think about how we answer it, both for ourselves and for the sake of others that we're seeking to bring into the fold. Yeah. Okay.
This is where outlining becomes, I think, really helpful too. You know, before you actually write your sermon, especially within a question-answer sermon this, is outlining it so you can see the progression,
right?
And then you start filling in the blanks,
right? So
that you can maybe kind of avoid that veering off. In a different direction.
You have an outline there, and that takes you through the flow. Now, when you said the lies issue, it made me think of something. The question-answered form. Right now, I'm presenting it to you where the answers are wrong. Sometimes it's not that the answers are wrong, it's just that they're partial. They're not complete. Yeah. And so you can actually affirm the answer, but then you can show how if that's all we had, we wouldn't have everything, right? And then you take them to the next one, and then finally the fullest and most complete answer. So it kind of depends on what your answers are. Okay. Good. Sorry to run through that one so quickly, but I wanted to do both of them, and so I had to choose one to go through quickly. Now let's do the other. So what we're going to do is we are going to walk through the classical argument design. I'm going to show you its roots in rhetoric, classical rhetoric, and we're going to watch as Luther appropriates it. Okay? Luther was very creative in his preaching. Some of his sermons, he's retelling stories, like the sermon I gave you earlier. Some of his sermons, he's doing verse by verse as he walks through the text. So the Walther sermon we had on the parable of the weeds, Luther has a sermon where he does the same text, but he just goes verse by verse through the text. Sometimes he has sermons where he's, like in this one, he's going to actually appropriate from classical rhetoric. My argument is that there are modes in which cultures communicate. And part of our work in preaching is to baptize the way our culture communicates and use it for proclaiming the gospel. And here we see Luther doing that with the classical rhetoric. So, during the Renaissance, there was something of a renaissance of Cicero. Cicero and Quintilian had been known by fragments, but fuller works were discovered, and the Orator, Cicero's The Orator, was one of those fuller works that was discovered. And so at the time of Luther and Melanchthon, there is this rediscovery of Ciceronian rhetoric. Melanchthon actually puts it in his rhetoric manual, so he was aware of it and he was teaching it to people, and we're going to watch as Luther uses it for preaching. The question is, why would I bring it up today? And that was kind of our opening, oh, I forgot to put this in, our opening discussion of our present context. Is that preaching in a post-Christian context, we have the problems of increasing biblical illiteracy. And so people are going to have questions about the texts and what these texts mean, and the classical argument design is another way of answering those questions. As a review of what we had said earlier, we also have our shifting cultural norms. This is the new I do, which tends to cause Christian understandings of faithful practice to be raised into question. So they've, marriage, because of divorce and divorce laws, and remember we were talking about legislating morality, because they need to legislate morality, they've distinguished between marriages that last less than 5 years and marriages that last over 5 years. Over 5 years has different compensation for a divorce than less than 5 years for a divorce. And now there's a desire to bring about what are called short-term contract marriages, where you're only married for a period of 2 to 5 years, and you contract that ahead of time. So we're not going to get married for life. We'll get married for 2 to 5 years, and after that we can renew our contract. Wow. I mean, so it's just really, it's changing. Things are changing. So we think, the big debate is about, male, female, female, male, female marriage. Well, there's another debate about just what is marriage. Do we really need to have a lifelong union with somebody? Isn't that unreasonable? And it's much better to have a short-term contract marriage instead, if you choose to get married, right? So this causes Christians to their life, the way God has called them to live, to not make sense. And a classical argument design can help us understand things like that. And we talked about the increasing hostility in our culture that makes Christian life and conversation much more difficult. And so I'd like to talk about this particular design, which I think is helpful for this. So the design is going to have 5 parts: an exordium, narratio, confirmatio, refutatio, peroratio. We're going to look at each one of those 5 parts. I'm going to define it from Cicero, and then we're going to look at the sermon and watch how Luther does it. Okay, so we're just going to walk through this form. This would be the 5 parts of your sermon if you were going to preach. So let's start with the first one, the exordium. What the exordium does is it clarifies the focus of the sermon. What is the main teaching of the sermon? What's it really going to be about? And it prepares the hearers for listening to that sermon. That's going to be what the exordium does. In rhetorical theory, Cicero argues that the exordium should foster a friendly hearing, an intelligent hearing, and an attentive hearing. And so the friendly hearing was often generated by the preacher complimenting the audience, complimenting the people about something. So I could have started out, I didn't, but I could have started out our conference by saying, I know you're all busy, I know you've traveled for hours to get here, and I just want to thank you and commend you for that type of commitment to continuing education. I should have said this, but I didn't, for continuing education in the faith, right? That would have been capitatio benevolentiae, right? That would have been giving you a compliment in order to gain a friendly hearing from you. Now, I think the way this translates into preaching is that this is the ethos of your pastoral care. We would hope that as the sermon opens, you already have a friendly hearing because of the way you have been a pastor among the people, right? So that the friendly hearing deals with the fact that this is going to be spiritual counsel and spiritual care. Intelligent hearing, that you want to help your hearers know what this is going to be about so that they can listen expectantly. Studies have shown that because of the use of cell phones and multitasking, that we are developing an inability to have deep reflective thought. That if you're kind of looking at pictures on a phone, you don't look at one picture and meditate on it. You do this, right? That we are just being trained to not have deep reflective thought. It used to be that the inductive method was all the mode, right? So everyone knows what you're going to say as a Christian, so let's start off somewhere creative that nobody has a clue where you're going to go, and we can lead them inductively. That used to be the big thing. Now, deductive preaching is making a comeback, and primarily because no one's going to listen for the whole sermon. They're just not going to be able to be there the whole time. And so what you do up front is you let them know what it's going to be about. This then creates what we call anticipatory listening. When they get lost in the middle of the sermon, which they will, they'll have a better chance of coming back in because they know from the front what it was going to be about. So an intelligent hearing would be there's clarity on what we're going to cover. Friendly hearing in terms of our relationship, and an attentive hearing, and the attentive hearing is often geared by the need for something or the significance for such a thing. So if we look at Luther's sermon, the first paragraph, could somebody read paragraph number 1? That's the exordium. It's very short, but if somebody could read paragraph number 1.
There is very much one could say in connection with today's gospel. However, for the present moment, we will limit ourselves to one point, undoubtedly the most important one, namely, how we should find comfort in the face of death. Certainly there is great need for such comfort in teaching. Okay. So notice the sermon itself is going to have the focus that Christ has power over death, and the function is going to be that my hearers find comfort in the face of death. Luther's exordium is very short, and it points directly to the function. From the very get-go, you know that this sermon is going to comfort you in the time of death. I believe he's relying on the pastoral relationship for the friendly hearing. He's just assuming, he's not assuming he has a group of people who aren't desirous of listening to him. So he's relying on the pastoral relationship for the friendly hearing. So he isn't doing any of the time that it would take to develop that. And he's connecting to the needs of the hearers by recognizing the nature of death and how this is something that we readily need words on. So it's a very simple introduction exordium for Luther.
Okay, so the next section is the narratio. The narratio basically summarizes the material. If you're thinking of, now this is a classical argument design, so it's used in law courts, okay? So it's used in deliberative rhetoric and judicial rhetoric. What are we going to do, or what is the judgment upon this case? So if you think about it in judicial rhetoric, rendering judgment upon a case, this would be the lawyer would come up and say on the night of January 16th, and then basically give you the facts of the case. So you summarize what it is about. But as we all should know, how you summarize sets people up for the point you're going to make, right? So for Cicero, this section needs to be clear, it needs to be convincing, and it needs to be admirable. So you want it to be clear, you want it to be convincing, and you want it to be admirable. For us, when now we're working with texts, and this is where your textual exposition of the sermon's going to go, so that one circle of the text, this is where it's going to happen. I think with the text, you're going to want to highlight what is most important for the sermon. So if you have a really long text and you're not going to cover the whole text in the sermon, in the narratio, just cover the portion that's most important. How is it convincing the narratio? Well, it's offering a scriptural basis for belief. This is our understanding of preaching as normed and guided by the scriptures. It's giving you a contact point with God's revealed word and the way in which God works in his world as your basis for belief. And it's admirable in that it creates a vivid hearing of the text. This is picking up on your creative imagination idea again. So you're not at this point just reading the text again. You're doing the text in a way that makes it creative and vivid for the hearers as they hear the text of Scripture, which highlights what is most important for the sermon. So those are going to be the three qualities that we look at in the narratio section. In the sample sermon, this is paragraph 2. Could somebody read paragraph 2?
Dearly beloved, we are considering here the account of a poor widow whose husband is already dead, and whose only son now also dies, leaving her in every way very dejected and destitute. For in Judaism it was reckoned especially a great misfortune if there was no son in the family, because under Jewish law that would leave a person without an heir. That explains why this widow is distressed and troubled, for it appeared as though God were against her and had completely abandoned her, first by taking away her husband, and now also her son. Her heart was very weighed down. She might well have despaired of God and concluded that he had forsaken her, allowing both her husband and son to die, thus taking away all earthly solace. You want me to read paragraph 3 as well? Christ our Lord,
yeah.
Christ our dear Lord feels deeply for her, and with sincere compassion gladdens her heart by raising her son from the dead and giving him back to his mother, so that her joy now becomes 10 times greater than her grief before. And it is a wonder that she did not immediately keel over and succumb because of her happiness.
I love that. I love that. So what's Luther doing that's creative in this section?
Well, he's not just reading the text. He's retelling the text in a way that anybody could just put themselves in that situation.
Right, he's retelling the text, and he's making stuff up.
Yeah.
Right? He's making say he does this a lot.
From the widow's perspective in particular.
Right, yeah. She may very well have thought that she was, despaired of God himself, right? I mean, the text doesn't say any of that, but he develops it, he explicates it, he meditates on it, he chews on it in a way that is creative and is bringing it to life. So on the one hand, we see that the material he does work with, he works with in a very creative way to make it vivid. What about the thing about highlighting what is most important?
Well, the idea that God is against her, but Christ is for her. Mm-hmm. I mean, by raising up her son and giving him back to her. Mm-hmm.
Does he?
There's nothing really in the text about her becoming extremely overjoyed or anything like this. It's
No.
just, he touches the
Right.
bier, raises him from the dead, and then
Gives it
goes
back to
on
the
his
mother.
way.
Right, yeah. So Luther's retelling the story to focus on two characters in the story, the widow and Jesus. He's really focusing, and each paragraph deals with one of the characters. So the first one deals with the widow and the trouble, and he develops the anguish of it. The second deals with Jesus and his compassion, and he develops the compassion of it. He completely erases the townsfolk and the disciples from the whole story. Remember, as the story opens, we have a procession of disciples going into the city, we have a procession of a funeral going out of the city, and those two processions intersect. And that's important when you think of the larger narrative, but Luther, for the sake of this sermon, doesn't need to focus on all of that material. Instead, he needs to focus on these simple two characters in order to bring his point to life. So he narrows the story down to the widow and Jesus. He arouses compassion for the widow by the way he retells her story. He creates a conflict between the widow and God, and then he brings in Jesus to resolve that conflict between the widow and God and to enact a compassion that's greater than our compassion for the widow. See, our compassion for the widow is we feel terrible about what has happened to her. We wish there was something we could do, but we can't raise her child from the dead. Jesus, however, has a deeper and richer compassion for that widow, which is the compassion of God, and he does something about that death and raising the child. So it's a very artfully constructed narratio for the sermon. My goal in the sermon is to give you comfort in the face of death, and now I'm going to tell you the story of the text, but as I tell you the story of the text, I'm just going to highlight certain details of it to kind of create this world that awakens you to the struggle that's going on and to what Jesus does in that struggle.
Well, that, and I think the way that Luther kind of brings you into the world of the widow, it's one of those where, at least in my opinion, at least the way I'm thinking and hearing it is, this is not that all far off of what a lot of people probably during his day have experienced.
Right.
Not just the death of a spouse, maybe because of war, and then
the
losing
children,
a child,
yeah,
and then you have this, and so it's not like a far stretch
Right.
to experience that whole
Right.
range of emotion that probably
Right.
what she's going through, and it really relates, it really connects. That's just,
Yeah.
to me.
So in order to do the narratio, you kind of need to know what the point of your sermon is going to be and how that point relates to the text. So if I'm retelling the story of the 10 lepers, and the point that I'm going to be making about that sermon is that Jesus includes all nations in his kingdom, because we have a Samaritan kneeling at his feet, praising God, and Jesus says, "Your faith has made you well." Notice how I'm probably not going to have a 10-minute section of my sermon talking about the gross disfigurement of leprosy, showing you videos of it, slides of it, giving you a missionary testimony of what it was like to live among people with leprosy and to talk with people who didn't have a nose and all that kind of stuff. It has nothing to do with what the sermon's going to do, right? So as you're developing material, you may find a lot of material about stuff, but it's only valuable in the sermon if it serves what you're trying to do in the sermon. So it isn't a matter, so this is kind of the narrowing down that happens in the narratio. Okay, so you open with the exordium, go to the narratio. The third one is the confirmatio. And the confirmatio now supports and develops the main teaching of the sermon. For Cicero, what this does is it addresses the point at issue with support in an admirable way. It addresses the point at issue with support in an admirable way. And let's talk a little bit about what he means by point at issue. So in Ciceronian rhetoric, this was called the stasis, the point at issue in an argument. And there are three different points that could be at issue. It could be a question of conjecture, of definition, or quality. Conjecture is the question, did it really happen? It's a question of the reality of something. Did it really happen? If something did really happen, now the question is, what is it? What do we call it? How do we identify it? That's the question of definition. If something really did happen, and it is what we call it, then the question is going to be, what is the quality of how it happened? So let's use a secular example. Let's say that we have a videotape of a carjacking that happened at an intersection. The first question in argument is going to be, did this really happen? So we have an accusation that somebody carjacked somebody, and then they bring out a videotape from the intersection, and we see this guy open the door of a car, shove the woman to the other side, and drive out of the intersection. Okay, so the question of conjecture is answered. It really did happen. We have a videotape. Now there's the question of definition. Is this carjacking? Are you carjacking if you take control of someone's vehicle while they're in the vehicle, or do they need to be out of the vehicle? So maybe it wasn't carjacking, maybe it was kidnapping, right? I mean, what is it? Do they need to be, if they're in the vehicle, what is it? So then we come to a definition that yes, you can carjack with somebody still in the vehicle. Okay, so it is carjacking. So now we have to answer, well, what's the quality? Why was it done? Is this because the guy was trying to steal the car? And then when we bring the witness on the stand, the guy says, I saw the woman was having an epileptic seizure and she was going to drive into the intersection and kill herself. And so I jumped in the car, shoved her across, and drove it out into safety. Well, now, it is carjacking technically, but the quality of the action raises all sorts of other questions, right? So this is what's called the stasis, the point at issue. What's the point at issue? And I think these are sometimes helpful things to think about when we're thinking about our teaching. Some Christian teachings are dealing with conjecture. Did it really happen? And so we're talking to people about the creation account in the Old Testament. Did this really happen? We're talking to them about the parting of the Red Sea. We're talking to them about a miracle. We're talking to them about the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. And it may be that the point at issue is a question, did it really happen? And so that's going to shape the way we defend it. It might be that it's really a question of definition. There's no question that it happened, but the question is, what is it? So somebody's been reading Joshua, and they look at it and they say, this looks like ethnic cleansing. This looks like you're entering into a land of another people and killing them all, and then taking possession of their land. So there's no argument that it happened. Our opponents are willing to concede that this happened, the conquest of Israel happened, but the question is it ethnic cleansing or not? That's an issue of definition. Or it may be that it's a question of quality. Why did it happen? Why did it happen? And so I've got people who are in agreement that it happened. They are in agreement of what it is, but they don't know why it happened. And I would say a lot of our preaching falls into the last category of the quality, and the answer is usually going to be for you. The answer is usually going to be for you. This is why it happened. That this act in history, and this is what we call it, has been done for you.
But in your example and in answering the question and getting to quality, you redefine carjacking as ultimately compassion. Right. So,
Right.
and in your example of Joshua,
Right.
we might be redefining ethnic cleansing as,
Right.
as something else.
Right.
So you're ultimately changing.
But you see, when I get to this, and when I get to this point in the sermon, I really need to think about my hearers and where are they on the spectrum? Are they thinking that this never happened, in which case I'm going to deal with it one way? Are they thinking that it did happen, but they don't know what it is, right? So yeah, I believe Paul gave this commandment to women, that they will be saved by childbearing, but I don't know what that is. So it's a question of definition. They believe Paul gave it, but they don't know what it is. Or maybe they know what it is, but they don't know why. They don't know why it's that way. So yeah, I see that they gave the commandment that women need to wear veils in church, but I don't know why. Why would they do that? And so it's a question of quality. So those three, I think it's just a real helpful thought of argument as we're thinking about preaching and where are our hearers as we bring a teaching to them.
So how often do you have to kind of wrestle with all three? I mean, does it become necessary to kind of
but you
tackle
see,
all three?
You're right that this is the sequence that you would go through, right? So if you you may have to wrestle, you may actually want to get to the quality, but to get there, you have to go through the conjecture and the definition.
Well, I'm thinking how you talked about spaces, right?
Right,
'Cause
rhetorical spaces.
The rhetorical spaces in the sense of there may be people who,
Mm-hmm.
some are past the conjecture level, but some are at the conjecture level. So,
Right.
I'm just thinking
Right.
in order to create that space, the
Right.
necessity of wrestling with all three.
Right, or you may need to say, there are some for whom this account is just a fairy tale, but I'm not one of those. And I'm not speaking to people who feel that way. I recognize that you feel that way. I'd love to talk to you, but for right now, I'm speaking to those for whom this isn't a fairy tale, this is real, because we have other things we're wrestling with. We know it's real, but we're wondering, why did it happen? Right, and so it's a way of, that creates the rhetorical space, right, where the other people can now listen in, and they know that you're compassionate with where they're at, but they also know that this isn't the time that you're going to deal with that. Instead, you're going to deal with the people who are here.
Right, so this is Easter stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not gonna stand here and prove to you the resurrection.
No.
When we've been preaching the resurrection
Right.
for 51 weeks.
Right.
For the sake of your
Right.
grandmother or your granddaughter who never comes and isn't
Right.
Christian.
Right, yeah. So this is kind of how you do the rhetorical spaces move to kind of take care of that. And for the admirable way Cicero deals with, he deals with a lot of the ways in which you tell things. You're trying to engage human emotions. You're working with pathos. You can use dialogue. You can work with plotting, suspense, and surprise. That's what would make it engaging or admirable. So let's look a little bit at Luther's sermon. The Confirmatio goes from paragraph 4 all the way to paragraph 11. So it's going to be too long of a section to read, but
Hey, just because we're in Alabama, I think we can handle it.
you can handle it.
So just because we're in Alabama.
No. I mean, it's too long for you to read. I mean, it's too long for us to cover it. But let's say a few things about this. For Luther, the point at issue is a stasis of quality. You're going to notice that he assumes that people believe it happened. He doesn't need to prove the reality of the raising of the child at Nain. So he believes that people know it happened, and he also believes that they define it as a miracle. Those are two things he believes. What is that question is why. Why did Jesus do this miracle? And that's paragraph 6. You begin to see where he starts to explore the stasis of quality. Could somebody read paragraph 6?
That is what we should learn from today's gospel lesson, namely, the great power God will exert upon us through Christ on Judgment Day, when this one word he will call forth from the dead all people and bless the believers eternally. He will say, Martin Luther, arise, and it will be so, and immediately I shall stand there. Therefore, we must not doubt that Christ possesses both the power to do it, as he demonstrates here, and the will, earnestly desiring to do it. For here we have a prototype. The widow's son is dead, with all senses and hearing stopped, but as soon as Christ speaks to him, he hears. This is certainly an unusual, astonishing story. The one who does not hear, hears. The one who does not live, lives. And yet Christ does nothing more than open his mouth and tell him to arise. That one word is so powerful that death must yield and life again returns.
Okay, so notice how it's a stasis of quality. Why is Christ doing it? And Luther's argument is that he is doing it to reveal the great power that Christ will have on Judgment Day to raise us from the dead. And so that's the focus of the sermon, that Christ has power over death, and he's going to address that point at issue. Why does Jesus do this? To reveal that power. And now, the admirable way, this is where the sermon gets very fun and creative. Listen, I'm going to read this portion. Listen to how Luther, not that you do a bad job, but I like it so much, I want to do it. I like this part. So this is starting at paragraph 7. So because we see how Christ can very easily snatch us from death and restore us from life, and so earnestly wants to do so, as we see here, therefore we should accept this example as sure evidence of how Christ demonstrates his power over death, in order that we might take comfort in him and not fear death. Do you notice how he's basically stated the focus and function of the sermon? Christ has power over death. That's the teaching of the faith. What's the purpose of it? So that we might have comfort. Now it gets fun. For it is for our sake that this wonder occurred. We are to understand that Christ is saying to us, I well know that you are afraid of death, but you must not be afraid. Do not let your heart be troubled, for even though it has terrors for you, what can it do to you? Terrify you it may. But on the other hand, learn not merely to look at how it affects you and causes you terror. Look to me. See what I'm able to do and earnestly want to do. Namely, I can very readily raise you from the dead as easily as you rouse someone from sleep, and desire very much to do so, having both the necessary power and intention. So he puts words into Jesus' mouth. Jesus now is talking in present tense to the hearers in the sermon, encouraging them of what he's going to do. So he's done the dialogue, now he's going to move to analogy. It follows from this, therefore, that those who lie dead and buried in the churchyard and under the ground sleep more lightly than we do in our beds. We know it can easily happen that a person sleeps so soundly that he's called 10 times before he ever hears. But the dead hear that lone word of Christ and wake up. The moment he speaks that one word, young man, I say unto you, arise. Lazarus, come forth. Talitha cumi, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. They hear in that very instant. And on Judgment Day, when he speaks that one word, the dead will hear in the very same moment and come forth from the graves. It's true. We sleep more soundly in bed than we do in the churchyard. Thus, before our God, death is not death, but a sleep. For us, when we die, it is termed death. But before God, it's but a sleep, and a very light sleep at that. Of this our dear Lord wants to convince us, so that we do not become frightened if pestilence or death itself approach, but we learn to say, death, what's the worst you can do to us? You have frightening teeth, you bear them, and you terrify me, and I do not die gladly. But I don't want to consider only what you can do, how you, like the executioner, draw the sword. I want to ponder and perceive how our Lord God will intervene, even though you strangle me. He does not fear you, nor is he awed by your raging and ravaging, but says, death, I shall be the death of you. Grave, I shall be your destruction. If you can kill my Christians, I can in turn throttle you and recall them to life. This is the comfort which the Lord holds before us in today's gospel as he defiantly confronts death. Death, you are terrifying my Christians to keep them from dying cheerfully, but beware, I shall terrify you in turn. You strangle them, but when you have done so, I shall in return destroy you. You say, Paul I have devoured, Luther I've cut down, death, boast all you want. Those whom you have put to death are not dead to me. Instead, they sleep, and they sleep so lightly that I'm able to awaken them with my little finger. So there you see the creativity, right? It's dramatic. It's this present tense speaking of Jesus, teaching the truths of the faith. He actually puts into the mouths of the Christian the confession he wants them to make. I want you to have comfort in the face of death. And so he actually has you overhear a Christian saying, death, you can do horrible things to me, but I don't fear you. I want to think about what my Lord can do, how my Lord can pursue you and fight you and put you to death. So the Christian overhears what it's like to believe. It's just amazing the way he's doing this as he makes his argument. So that's kind of the section of Confirmatio where he's doing the teaching. Thoughts on that?
I like the vivid language.
Yeah, right? Yeah, it's
draws you in.
Powerful, dramatic. Yeah. What he's doing theologically in terms of his reasoning, and this is something that you often do with miracle texts, is he's taking the event of the miracle, which is the raising of the child in Nain, and he's putting it into a larger realm of conflict. So you have one death, and Luther is expanding that to talk about death with a capital D. Or in the text, you might have one demon possession, and you expand it to talk about the satanic kingdom. Or in the miracle text, you might have one storm on a sea, but you expand it to talk about the chaos of the world. Or in a miracle text, you may have one contest with religious authorities, but now you speak about the opponents of the faith, right? So Luther, kind of what he does is he tells the story, but then he shifts from the story as a prototype to talk about this larger realm of conflict. That then sets him up to proclaim what I call the larger realm of rule. So if your larger conflict is death, Jesus will be the Lord of life. If your larger conflict is Satan, Jesus will be the Lord of hosts, who comes and defeats Satan. If your larger conflict is the chaos of creation, Jesus will be the Lord of creation, who was there when it was made and restores it in the end. If your conflict is religious authorities, Jesus will be revealed as the Lord of the church. And so the theological paradigm Luther is using is one way of looking at the miracle text. Whenever you have a miracle text, what is the conflict in the event of the text? And how can you expand that to a larger realm of rule for your people? And once you have your people entrapped in that larger realm of rule, either death, Satan, chaos, or religious leaders, then you shift to your proclamation of Christ, and it's either going to be Christ's defeat of death and bringing life, Christ's defeat of Satan in his kingdom, Christ's defeat of chaos and restoration of creation, or Christ's being Lord of the church. And so that kind of shapes the way you preach the gospel. It's a little hom too thrown in, just for fun. Okay, and then this then is for you. So you kind of move from the conflict through the realm of rule, and then show how in the Word and the sacraments, this Lord of all creation is now meeting you here in this place. That's the beauty of that theological framework. Okay, so we've got two more to go. One is refutatio. And this is where you now take on the opponents of the teaching. So for most of us, Luther's sermon would have been over. He's gotten to the gospel. He has a very powerful proclamation of the gospel. It's beautiful. It's for you. Amen. Let's sing a hymn. But Luther goes on and starts talking about the Turks and the papists. And we begin to say, oh man, he's ruining the sermon. Why is he stirring up all the trouble? Well, because Luther knows that these are the conflicts that his people live in. And so he's trying to equip them to argue against their opponents. So part of the sermon is going to be the refutatio, which defends the teaching you are proclaiming from the opponents who oppose it. For Cicero, the three things he wants to think about are the necessity of this, the nature of it, and the order of it. So, necessity, there's a distinction of how I do this. If some of my members have this false teaching, I'm going to do it in a different way than if it's a false teaching out in the world. I don't want to do refutatio for something that nobody is experiencing in their lives or out in the world, right? So it isn't a matter of, bringing in some controversy that nobody has and telling them about it. So I'm defending you to defend the faith against people who died in the 3rd century. Well, I kind of want to work with today. Is this a problem among you or among others? And then the nature of the defense. Either it's going to be a defense where you kind of just attack the opponent completely, or it's going to be a defense where you concede that the opponent has some things right. If you attack the opponent completely, it's going to be kind of a very black-white matter going on. If you can find something to concede, you will appear as more compassionate, because you at least have listened and you've recognized that there are some things they're talking about that are right. Okay, so that's the value of the conceding, something that the opponents have. And then the order in which you want to do it, this is a bigger question. Sometimes in the classical argument design, the confirmatio and the refutatio can switch. So you can either go from narratio to refutatio, or you can go from narratio to confirmatio. The question is, which should go first? And basically, the argument is that when you have an extremely weak opponent or an extremely strong opponent, you start with confirmatio. because the strong opponent is not going to listen anyway, and the weak opponent doesn't need their weakness torn down before they hear what is true. They might be convinced by the presentation of the truth. So you start with confirmatio. When you have a moderately strong opponent, you actually need to start with the refutatio first, because I need to get this out of the way in order to gain a hearing. So I need to kind of deal with what your arguments are before I can now move into my own. Because otherwise you're not going to listen, because the whole time you're going to be saying yes, but, yes, but. So I need to get that out of the way before we go into mine. So that's the issue of order. So for Luther, this section of the sermon is basically from, just so you can mark it for yourself and read it later, from paragraph 12 to paragraph 14. That's the refutatio. And what Luther does in this section is notice he affirms that his opponents do believe in hell and judgment. So that's good. I mean, that's not true for us today, but for his day, it was true. He could say, you know, at least my opponents, the Turks and the Papists, they believe in hell and judgment. The problem is that they think that Christ is going to be a stern judge of believers and that he's going to evaluate you on the basis of your works. And so Luther, therefore, is going to affirm their belief in hell and judgment, but he's going to oppose their depiction of Christ as a stern judge and instead proclaim Christ as a friend of sinners. And this now helps you understand why Luther spent so much time with the compassion of Christ for the widow. Right? He wanted you to see that compassion early on in the sermon because it'll support this section here. And then the last section is the peroratio, which is basically the conclusion of the sermon. Two ways to do your conclusion, two things that are going to happen. One, there's going to be a recapitulation. This is where you'll state the main teaching for the hearers. And the other will be amplification, where you shoot for the heart. You can kind of develop the thing emotionally, develop the thing by your character, or develop it by offering somebody a summary of all of the reasons. That's going to be a way of bringing the sermon to closure, that I've got the teaching, and not only do I have the teaching for my head, but I'm experiencing it in my heart. I see how powerful this is with the closing story that you're offering or the summary that you're giving me. And for Luther, you'll notice in his section, paragraph 14, he revisits the function. He connects it to the text through a theological framework. So he's going to tell you about the comfort. He's going to show you how this is for the widow and how it's for us in Christ because he's Lord over death. And then he will move into his evangelical exhortation of the hearers to have comfort, and he'll kind of close with this dramatic dialogue, letting us overhear what it sounds like. So those would be Luther's ways of doing it. Sorry to have moved quickly, but I wanted to try to get two through to you today. So this is the classical argument. Any thoughts about this method for using it?
So could you give us an example of a moderately strong opponent? What that might, when you use that phrase, what that might, and I guess without an example, I don't know.
Well, in my congregation, they went through a split in the walkout, right? So in order to process things, I first need to deal with that objection. This is going to cause another split. I mean, that is the number one objection. And I'd say, what's going to cause another split? Well, whatever you're going to say, it's going to cause another split, right? I mean, you haven't even heard my idea yet. You know it's going to cause another split, right? So I'm going to need to deal with that issue of why do we split? For what reasons do we split? Sometimes splits are good and sometimes splits are evil. And kind of help them understand that not everything that happens is necessarily going to be a split. And sometimes splits are important and are right. And so they're hard to suffer through, but they're right. And so I need to get them on page about being comfortable with recognizing that it isn't just kind of me throwing out an idea, not caring whether it'll be a split or not. No, I recognize the danger of splits, and I also recognize the value of them. And so now, having thought about that, now let's think about the idea. So that would be, so it just depends upon the disposition of the hearers. That would be kind of a situation in my church that just came to mind, but yeah.
I think it's St. Mark in the baptism of Jesus that uses schism for the heavens open.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
is, and I preach to a circuit, it's the exact same idea that, is it a good schism?
Right, right.
Some schisms are great.
Yeah, yeah. And so depending on where your hearers are at with whatever the teaching or the thing is that you're dealing with, right? So, it may be that before we can even listen to what the text says about women, we have to deal with the sense that the Apostle Paul shouldn't be thought about in terms of women because he denigrates them. And I just need to kind of take us through that before we can even listen to what he says. Or it may be that that's not really, I don't have really a hostile audience, so I can just start out with what Paul's saying, and we can celebrate and see what Paul says about women, and then talk about how, here's what the opponents are going to say Paul is doing, and here's how we would answer that. Right? Does that make sense?
So I just kind of have to ask, do you think, which did Luther think of his opponents in this sermon? Were they strong or weak?
Yeah.
Since he begins with the confirmatio.
Right. Well, this is 1530 something, right? And he's got the opponents are the Turks and the
Well, Turks,
papists.
Jews, papists,
Yeah.
monks.
Yeah, he's just kind of throwing it all in.
He just kind of casts it
Yeah,
everywhere.
he's throwing it all in. So I think he's more inclined to just see that nobody else has this teaching, this understanding of the last day.
In a worldly sense, they're very, very strong. They're literally at the gates.
Yeah. Right.
But in a theological sense,
Yeah,
Theological
they're,
sense.
they're weak and they're nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of an issue of for your hearers.
He's almost casting them off because
Right.
his hearers aren't going to be, at this point,
Right at this point.
very much in line with them anymore.
Right,
If this
right.
was 1518,
Right, it might be different depending on his hearers, right? Because remember, it's the point at issue is not how strong my opponents are, but how strong my opponents are for these people.
how strong these people think they are.
Right, and that's how I need to deal with it. Okay, I hope it was engaging. It's a lot. So, okay, good. Thanks a lot.